I'm determined to help him. Now, if I heard that, what do you think would happen to my expectation? It'd go up. But if even more than that, the owner of John Wayne said, David, I want you to know this, that if your pastor ever needs help, I'm going to help him according to the riches of the glory of my company and my wealth. And David, if you ever have to come to me and ask me for help for your pastor, I want you to ask me and remind me of that very reality that I told you. I encouraged you to come ask me that way, according to these riches. And then my expectation is going to go even higher. But if on top of all that, I found out the guy that owns this thing is a billionaire and the riches of his glory are untold, unfathomable, I mean, what then? See, you have to recognize this. Paul isn't just praying this. Paul's under inspiration. God told him. See that God's people need to have their perception and comprehension of the love of my Son to them increased. I want you to ask me on their behalf. And Paul, I'm inspiring you to come and plead based on the riches of my glory. Do not come and ask less than that. You see what I'm driving at here? If we, brethren, in the weeks ahead, I want to explore the love of Christ. But I know this, if we attempt to look in these coming weeks, we look and admire, we attempt to, and delve into the love of Christ. And you know what? If 6 months from now, it's like, you didn't even remember what I was preaching on back in June. You're left unaffected. You're left dry. You're left still feeling like I need revival. You're left distant. You're left cold. You're left calloused. You're left unmoved. You know what? That would be like a billionaire promising the most astounding air conditioning system that money can buy. Something so magnificent, a unit out there that's unimpressive and average. You know what? It's unimpressive and average when we talk about the love of Christ for people to yawn, for people to think about what they're doing in the afternoon. It's unimpressive and average for our church to look at the love of Christ over a number of weeks and then determine that movies are better. That's unimpressive. What I'm saying here is, look, if God himself said, Paul, I want you to pray according to the riches of my glory, for them to be strengthened to comprehend the love of Christ, does that sound unimpressive and average? And see, this is an appeal to God. If I said, well, you know what this is really about? You know what Paul's teaching here? Paul's teaching that we really have to strive. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't really strive. We do need to really strive, but that's not the point of the text. The point of the text is that God is being appealed to give us according to the riches of his glory. And you know what? If people are going to prefer sports, or they're going to prefer the movie, or they're going to prefer their hobby, or they're going to prefer some other thing, the truth is that's normal. That's man left to his own strength. Is that an indication of the riches of the glory of God to comprehend much more the dimensions of the love of Christ? I mean, certainly we would expect something impressive and life-changing. Listen, if God answers this prayer, what would you expect? What are your expectations? You say, I don't really have any. I'm saying look at this prayer and have an expectation. Listen, if God is telling Paul to pray for you and to pray not some meager little thing, but to ask God and beseech him, Father, according to the riches of your glory, make this happen. I would expect more than 4 weeks down the road here, we're all basically unaffected. Well, we're just the same as we were 4 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago. Because then that's like, Father, why? Why did you put this here? We may say, well, we didn't pray it. Well, I've been praying it. And I'll continue to pray it. And Paul prayed it. Lord, why would you... I mean, if we get down the road and that happens, is Lord, why would you stir Paul to pray this way and in inspired fashion unless you truly mean to give us what's being talked about here? This is a prayer for God to do something. It's in the song. We're praying, God, revive us again. This is the heart of revival. This is where it is. It always has been. When revival comes, what is it that happens to God's people? There's an awareness of God. There is an awareness of His love for His people. Will you be content, brethren, to be unmoved, to be untouched, to not be strengthened? I would say, God forbid that that should happen. You know what? You know what came to my mind is I read in Scripture that the heavens, we are told in Psalm 8, it is the work of God's finger. I ask myself this question. Does that sound like it exhausted the riches of God's glory when it's the work of His finger? Oh, it declares His handiwork. It declares something of His glory, but it's the work of His finger. When I hear according to the riches of His glory, to me that sounds bigger. If I went in my backyard and I did some work with my fingers, does that reflect the riches of the glory of who I am? Paul isn't asking that we be strengthened according to the work of God's finger, but asking to be strengthened according to the entire riches of God's glory. That makes me think it's something greater than the universe. This really ought to give us an expectation that God will do something. I have it. Shall we be content to be confronted with all of this? Are you content to just remain unchanged? Listen, you may be weary and you may be heavy laden. You may be tired, exhausted. Your arms may be hanging down. You may be discouraged, depressed. But is there an ache? Are you just willing to be content with that? Or can you look at a promise and does the Spirit of God give you some hope? Yes. Yes, there is a promise here. What I want you to do is I want you to have your expectations raised. Like, Lord, if you said this, you mean it. And I'm going to hold you to it. And I'm going to keep reminding you of this until I get this. I mean, what do you think God wants us to think when the riches of His glory are put on the table as the ground of all this? You think He wants you to be content? You should ask yourself that question. I would say no. If we get a month down the road, basically nothing happens or can't even remember what was preached, what shall we say? I mean, yes, we can say the problem is with us. Yes, we can say that. I mean, brethren, that is exactly what Paul is praying about here. We're weak, and we need to be strengthened. I recognize the problems with us. I recognize the problem lies in our weakness. But you see, that's the very thing Paul is praying, is that in our weakness we'd be strengthened. Yes, our weakness is the issue, but the expectation is that God will do something to overcome our weakness. Are you feeling lethargic? Yes, but that's why you need strength. Or do you feel like you need revival? Yes. Do you feel cold? Listen, maybe some of you are kind of riding a high spot in your Christian life. He This is the prayer. He will intervene and come and strike power into our weakness and give us comprehension at a level that we would otherwise never have if He doesn't come and deal with us according to the riches of His glory. That's the issue. Yes, we're weak. Yes, we're perhaps dull. We're forgetful. Oh, we are forgetful. Because you know what? I've had past seasons in my Christian life that were wonderful, that were glorious, and that were up there on the plateau. But you know, I know two things. One, we're very forgetful. We forget about how glorious it was. But two, we don't live too well on yesterday's manna. We don't live well on yesterday's revival. We need it today. We need fresh things today. Yes, we're slow. Yes, we're far too content to spend our time in the lowlands, paddling around the edges of the ocean when there are such things to be discovered that we've never imagined. The question is this. I ask you, do you expect God to help us, to come and empower? You embrace this with a determination to have God do what He undoubtedly is promising to do. He wouldn't have put this prayer in His Word if it wasn't His desire to give us a hope that He intends to do something with regards to it. Now, look at verse 18. You see the word comprehend? That you may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth. The word comprehend, like I said before, in an offhanded way, he's praying that the Spirit would strengthen us so that we might comprehend. Obviously, we are not left in a place where we're just passive. This implies something. But he's praying that the Spirit of God would so blow upon the people of God that we would be strengthened for this to happen. Comprehend. What's the word? It has a prefix, kata, which brings intensity to it. It's to grasp with force, to comprehend, to lay hold of. The idea here is to seize, to acquire with significant effort. So let's try to grasp Christ's love with an effort that at least looks somewhat significant. We know, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And on the other side of the coin, it's God who works in us both to will and to do of His good pleasure. We can trust God to do this, but we need to be putting ourselves in the place for this to happen. There are places that God tends. Charles Leiter, this undoubtedly is in one of his books, but I just remember him telling me about how Mona visited some of these Welsh folks where Martin Lloyd-Jones used to vacation. And they lived on this farm. They got their power from water that flowed off the mountain and turned a generator. They got their power. But sometimes their power would go out. What would happen? Well, limbs and garbage would collect in there. Right before the generator was a screen. And so this stuff would come down, pushed by the torrent of water, and it would collect there on this grating. And if it impeded the flow, no power, no electricity, no flow beyond that point. And so they'd have to go out and pull the stuff off. And Charles talks about that as being a good illustration of the Christian life, keeping those channels open. There's things that clog the screen. Putting ourselves in an optimal position to be visited by the Lord. Perhaps there's things in your life that you know they're impeding the flow, they're grieving the Spirit, they're quenching the Spirit. James just this morning was telling me about a covenant, reminding me, he told me before, that he made concerning a certain thing in his life. Brother Craig just the other day was talking about earlier back in January, just making a determination about something. You know, some of us, and I've been at those points where it's just like you get aggravated with something, you recognize it's impeded your Christian life long enough. And you say, no more. I don't want that anymore. Lord, I'm done with it. For good. You want to be careful when you begin to make vows before the